Well, Lance Larsen, I'd like to welcome you to the Chase Home, Museum of Utah Folk Arts, here in the middle of Liberty Park in Salt Lake City. Congratulations on being named the new Poet Laureate of Utah.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah. Well, listen, just to really quickly, I'm sure a lot of people would like to know what the Poet Laureate is, maybe a little bit about the history of it. Tell us what you know about Poet Laureates. I mean, isn't there a long tradition of Poet Laureates?
Yes, it dates back to the English and possibly before, but in the state of Utah we've had three. I make the fourth. The first was David Lee, and I think he was inaugurated sometime in the early 90s, late 80s. The Poet Laureate's job, I think, is to promote the arts. Not just poetry, but the other literary arts, essay, fiction, and so forth.
So why isn't there a fiction laureate or a creative nonfiction laureate, or what is it about poetry?
An ineffective lobby. I'm not sure. There's a tradition of it being the Poet Laureate. In fact, there are a couple states that have a neutral assignment, so it's not genre specific, but I'd say 90% of the states that have a Poet Laureate emphasize the poetry aspect.
So tell us a little bit about your background as a poet. I mean, when did you start writing poetry?
I didn't start writing poetry till I was in college, but I loved writing in grade school. When we were given assignments to write, my friends would cringe and I would secretly celebrate. I always wanted to write the strangest or goriest or most bizarre story. It's always a kind of competition, you know, like
so you
sinking free throws.
So you started out as Stephen King, and
yes, exactly, and devolved from there.
Right. Well, you probably aren't getting paid as well as Stephen King, but
no.
So from starting early then as a poet, obviously in high school and college, you picked up on it.
The pivotal course was a college class when I was a sophomore, because for the first time I read real stories and poems. Raymond Carver, I think. Flannery O'Connor, people like that. I remember a poem by James Wright called A Blessing. He has a line in which he describes a horse's ear as being as delicate as the skin over a girl's wrist. And I found that devastating and beautiful and never quite recovered. Also tried my hand at putting words together myself.
Right.
By the end of the semester, I changed my major and have been tinkering with words since.
So when was your first experience with publishing poetry? I mean, you've got a fourth book coming out, I think, at the end of this year. It's 2012. How difficult was it to get published?
I think I published my first poem in a literary journal published by and for and of college students. So it was, and I think I was rejected twice before I made it into that magazine.
Good to know. Good to know. You do get it rejected before you
oh yeah, everyone gets rejected. That's the name of the game. I think 3 years after that class, or 4 years, I landed a couple poems in some obscure national journals.
So it really is about kind of, especially when you first get started, it's about a kind of a selected audience or self-selected audience, maybe what you'd call a niche audience of people interested in poetry.
Right. It's a matter of persistence mostly.
So a lot of people are talking about how poetry is kind of taking off, and now we're trying to define poetry maybe so that not everything is poetry. There's slam poetry going on. There's a resurgence in recitation of traditional poetry. Some people would argue that rap music is a kind of poetry. What's your definition of poetry?
I always fall back on other people's definitions. I think Coleridge said the best words in the best order. And that's a pretty flexible definition.
The best words in the best order.
Right.
I like that. So that could be any number of things, but the kind of poetry that you're writing and that you'll be reciting in readings around the state of Utah during your 5-year tenure as Poet Laureate, what can people expect?
Well, for lack of a better term, I'd call it traditional poetry, poetry that first is determined by how it appears on the page. Sir Philip Sidney, many hundred years ago, talked about poetry having two functions, to delight and to instruct.
Okay.
I think traditional poetry sometimes emphasizes the instruction a little bit too much. And so the performance poetry that you're talking about, poetry slams and so forth, leans more toward the delighting end of things. And so I think traditional poets can learn something about paying attention to an audience and delighting them in the moment, and vice versa. Slam poets can learn something about trying to write something that will last longer than this performance, but last for 6 months or 100 years or whatever it might be.
So, Lance, what poets do you admire?
We were talking about slam poetry. Bob Hickok, a poet originally from Michigan, who I think lives in Virginia now, started out as a slam poet, and he was not a part of the academy. He hadn't gone to college. He got a taste of poetry, won some contests and went on the circuit, and eventually became a more traditional poet. He's published 4 or 5 books and is very well respected. So I like the immediacy of his work and the informality of it, and I think that he comes at that quite naturally because of his experience as a performer. But then he wanted the tradition as well.
Sure.
So he wedded those in really interesting ways.
I'll bet he's a terrific reader of his poetry.
Yeah. I haven't heard him, I've met him, but I haven't heard him read yet.
Right.
I hope to hear him.
So in your tenure, your 5-year tenure here in Utah as Poet Laureate, what can, I suspect you'll be traveling around. Are there certain kinds of events you like to do more than others? Are you, obviously you're accustomed to doing readings. Do you read only your own poetry or other people's poetry, or it just depends? It
just depends, whatever the audience is interested in. I did a reading with 3 or 4 other poets in which we were promoting an anthology of poems about music. And so each of us read a poem or 2 involving music by other poets. I imagine with this position that I will visit whichever audiences are craving poetry, whether that be K through 12 classrooms, universities, rest homes. I've read at a rest home before.
There's a huge population in rest homes, and pretty soon we'll be there as well.
Absolutely.
So hopefully the Poet Laureate will come visit us.
Yeah.
So I would like to think that poetry transcends a lot of different, not only other artistic genres, but other sectors of society that maybe aren't traditionally thought of as being an audience for poetry. Maybe even the corporate world. I'm thinking of David White, for example. Do you have any initiatives that you might be kind of looking at during the next 5 years to maybe bring poetry to the people, as it were?
I haven't committed to a specific program yet, but I'm interested in, earlier we talked about poetry recitation, poetry out loud. I think that's a terrific program.
Right, a program of the Arts and Museums here. Right. That's right.
And this year we had the winner of the state of Utah went on to nationals and took 3rd place.
That's right, Marquet.
Marquet, that's right, from Logan, if I remember.
From Logan High School. Yep, Marquet Hassan. And
great for her, right? I mean, she ended up with a $5,000 scholarship and a trip to Washington, D.C.
So there's money to be made.
Long shot money, sure. Yeah. Like playing the lottery. But I think anybody who got in front of a crowd for the first time was a winner. Anybody who memorized a poem that had not memorized one before. Anyone who connected with an author and felt something vivid on the page, that linkage, was a winner. I think I probably would have been too scared to recite myself in high school, but I think I could have benefited tremendously from this program.
What's your advice for a beginning poet?
Well, there are a few key things that I tell all poets who are interested in writing. One, read a lot. Get a hold of the Norton Anthology, read it from beginning to end. Write regularly, every day if you can pull it off. Find other like-minded people to read your work, whether classmates or teachers or someone else. Memorize poems, we talked a little bit about that.
Because memorization, I mean, keys right into the language, which is what poetry is about. So there's got to be something kind of chemical going on there when you're memorizing, I would think.
Well, and when I was in high school, I hadn't read the real stuff, but for me, the Moody Blues wrote what I thought was poetry, and sometimes it is poetry. And I would memorize it and write it out on my desk and hope that no one would trace my handwriting. But another thing is beginning poets need to eventually learn how to revise.
Okay, tell me about that. What do you mean by revise?
Revisit earlier work with an intent to make it better. I like what one poet said, try again, fail better. Samuel Beckett. Pretty good advice.
Very good advice, I would think so. Yeah.
Stay hungry. Whatever it is that drew you to poetry or the arts in the first place, tap into that. Don't lose that in your attempts to become professional.
Right.
Find the way to make it fun, always.
Right. Well, there are a lot of poetry groups throughout Utah and throughout the United States and the world, for that matter, and I think finding a community is probably part of that motivation to keep going.
Absolutely.
Well, Lance, it's been a pleasure having you here at the Chase home in Liberty Park, and again, congratulations on your award from Governor Herbert, who announced your 5-year tenure as Poet Laureate in May of 2012. So again, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, it's been a pleasure.